Hey guys, this is part 2 of Unit 14.1, dealing with the Civil Rights Movement. Trying to figure out if the 50s were the best time for the Civil Rights Movement. You think about the fact the Civil Rights case of Brown versus Board of Education, all of the beginnings of the boycotts and the Rosa Parks, the beginning of Martin Luther King's ministry and leadership. We left off with Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and actually I probably should have gone one more slide. Here's a enrichment if you want to watch, a short little deal dealing with the history of the I Have a Dream speech. Given that it's maybe the most important speech in American history, probably worth a closer look. But let's break down the rest of the outline on 14.1. So, as a result of mostly what went on in Alabama and Martin Luther King's leadership, they're going to pass something called the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was a very big moment in the Civil Rights Movement. Basically made Jim Crow laws, desegregation, segregation, etc., illegal. The federal government, the Congress said, we're not going to do this anymore. And there was a long filibuster. You could look up the filibuster of the Civil Rights Act, and just how long it took the Senate to finally agree to it. Remember a filibuster is when a senator can stand up and talk as long as he wants just to delay a bill. And finally, basically, the United States told him to sit down and shut up to pass the bill. Now, part of this was a result of the bombing of a church in Birmingham, 16th Street Baptist Church. And some idiot had put a bomb in there to blow it up to protest and blew up a Sunday school class, and 4 little girls were killed. When you start talking about the deaths of 4 beautiful little children like this, that sounds like something out of like terrorist movies today. And these were people in America blowing up people in America. And again, it's the rest of the nation is basically looking at the South saying, you guys are morons, and we're not going to let you disgrace us anymore. We're not going to let you humiliate America like this anymore. Now, this is an interesting picture here. You see Martin Luther King shaking hands with LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. This was because right before the Civil Rights Act was passed, John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. And John F. Kennedy was definitely a friend to the Civil Rights Movement. It took him a while. Definitely took him a while to come around. But there's a moment when people in his administration, basically, he turned around to everybody and said, they're right. You can use that pronoun, they're right, meaning black Americans. Everything they've wanted, everything they've been fighting for, they should have. And he just flipped the script. And it wasn't popular, but you remember, Democrats were a Southern party. And John F. Kennedy is is a Democrat. So he's alienating a huge part of his political base by saying, I'm going to support civil rights. But what he realized was that the rest of America was joining him. And he's like, all right, Southerners ain't going to vote for me. I'll get the rest of them to vote for me. And that's kind of what happened. The other key thing here is, when do blacks kind of flip and start voting Democrat? It's because of JFK and LBJ, 2 Democratic presidents who really worked to advance civil rights. Okay, we had freedom riders, and we have a freedom summer. 1964, large numbers, thousands of Northerners, white and black, went down into the South to do mostly voter registration. I was like, okay, Civil Rights Act has gotten rid of all these Jim Crow laws. Now let's go down and get these folks registered to vote. Let's get rid of the solid South. Let's make it to where blacks have rights and can vote. Remember the Freedmen's Bureau, where you had these northern whites coming down into the South to help with schools and education, etc. Very similar, and met with the same kind of violence. Remember, what was the KKK's first initial target? Republicans, Republican carpetbaggers coming into the South. Well, these 3 men right here were Freedom Summer college students come down into the South to help people get registered to vote, and they went missing. and their bodies were found later, beaten to death. And they caught some people, put them on trial. Well, what do you think is going to happen to some people accused of murder when their jury of their peers is a bunch of white folks just like them? Well, of course, yeah, they were acquitted and got free. Then the federal government said, you know what? We're not really hip to that result. And so the federal government did something a little different. It hadn't really been done very often. They accused the murderers of violating these people's civil rights. So the murderers weren't tried for murder, they were tried for violating civil rights, 14th Amendment kind of stuff. And they found them guilty and they went to federal prison, which is way worse than state prison. But the Freedom Summer is showing you a couple things. First, gains being made as blacks are now being able to register to vote, and violence ratcheting up as the South is kind of in its death throes of racism and segregation. There's a short little enrichment video which will help you see just how perilous it was for people going down into the South. If you can find this American experience, it's an entire series on the Freedom Summer, worth watching. Fast forward to 1965 in Selma, Alabama. Martin Luther King and the protesters were going into Selma on Sunday to protest, and they were met by the riot police, who, as you can see, got violent. That's why they refer to this time as Bloody Sunday. There's a very good movie that came out on this a few years back that if you have some free time, you're just kind of sitting around at home with nothing to do, great one to watch. But it shows that there's still progress to be made and there's still violence to be endured. Now, these protest movements are leading to some gains. The 24th Amendment is finally passed. Okay, so the 24th Amendment, we haven't talked about this. This gets rid of poll taxes. Okay, so the poll is where you go to vote. And if you remembered, one of the Jim Crow laws that was created to keep blacks from voting was make them pay for it. And they might not want to. Well, the 24th Amendment made that illegal. And I say, 246, that makes sense. Poll taxes don't make sense. It's not a great way to remember it. The other thing is it also started to work on this curious case called gerrymandering. Gerrymandering are crooked voted districts in which you can draw lines in a very interesting way so that your political party can gain an advantage. Now, there's a very good YouTube, Adam Ruins Everything, where he covers gerrymandering. But basically what would happen is Southerners would draw the lines for the voting districts to make sure that they always had a white majority. And the voting districts would look like, spilled pizza sauce, as opposed to, rectangles and squares for kind of normal lines, etc. And what the courts and the Congress was trying to do was put limits on gerrymandering. Still exists today, but again, we're starting to address some of the ways that blacks had been disenfranchised. We also had, missed on the outline, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which banned literacy tests. So 3 examples of legislation: Voting Rights Act, 24th Amendment, and gerrymandering laws. Okay. It gets to be a point where pace isn't fast enough, and America's in the midst of some protest movements. Vietnam War is a big part of this. Black soldiers were dying at higher rates than white soldiers. Some people felt like the civil rights movement wasn't going fast enough, and so there's some violence that is going to erupt. There's the Watts riots in Los Angeles. You can see some pictures of the rioting here, etc. You had riots in Detroit in which 45 people were killed. Here's where things get a little tricky, because if you remember, when it was nonviolent civil disobedience, people around the nation were against the segregation. They were against the whites who were pushing segregation because they saw these well-dressed, well-intentioned people protesting peacefully being met with violence. Well, now where's the violence coming from? It's coming from the blacks themselves. And some Americans kind of start to turn off. You remember when Reconstruction after the Civil War, the North kind of got tired of it. And they're like, you know what, this military Reconstruction thing where we've got all our troops down in the South enforcing the Reconstruction, enforcing all these Civil War amendments, they just got tired of it. Well, some people start to get tired of it. When you see the violence coming from the protesters, you don't have as much sympathy with the protesters. There was one point people had referred to violence had been used to keep blacks, to keep them in their place. Well, now they're fighting back. The violence is coming back at them. Remember Webb Du Bois said things were too slow. That's kind of one of the results here. And so we're going to have some new voices. One of those very, very famous voices is Malcolm X. Originally named Malcolm Little. He dropped the little because he referred to it as his slave name. He went to prison for some small crimes, and while he was in prison, he converted to the Nation of Islam and came out with a very strict and disciplined life, but calling for racial separation. Basically saying, whites are the devil. There's no way we can work with these whites. We need to be completely separated. Now, there's a lot of the history of this kind of how we get here. Webb Du Bois pushing for political movement. Then you went to Marcus Garvey. Remember, he had pushed for the Back to Africa movement in the 1920s. We're never going to make it in America. Let's just go home. Well, Malcolm X, in a curious side note to history, took a Hajj, his pilgrimage to Mecca, and when he was in Mecca, he saw, that whites and blacks and browns and yellows and reds all worship Islam together. And he realized that the Nation of Islam had kind of gotten this wrong in pushing for racial segregation. And so he came back to the States and began to preach a little bit of a different message. And he was actually assassinated by some of his own men. They ran up in the middle of one of the meetings and shot him to death. It just shows you that violence is growing as even the leadership within the civil rights movement is disagreeing. You had a guy named Stokely Carmichael who started talking about black power. Great quote here. In order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience, which was so true. I mean, many of these Southerners didn't have a conscience. The racism was too deeply embedded. But don't forget that Martin Luther King's strategy was not to change the Southerners. It was the conscience of the rest of the country. And that's how so many gains had been made legislatively. It was the people in the Northeast and the people in the Midwest and the people in the West who were pushing for this legislation. He had referred to black power and brown power, etc. And it was at this time in the 1968 Olympics where two guys went gold, silver in the 200 meters and stood up on the podium during the national anthem and raised a black fist as a way of saying, America's not quite right. Very similar to Colin Kaepernick and the kneeling during the national anthem in the NFL. These guys have a right to protest and say America's, there's some mistakes being made. And you could also say that when you represent your country, there's times to make a protest and there's times not to. These guys actually paid a pretty heavy price. Their medals were taken from them by the U.S. Olympic Committee. And then last but not least, we have the Black Panthers. They were militants on patrol. They carried shotguns and assault rifles and went out to protect blacks. They talked about their afros, don't call us Negroes, an extremely violent group, basically on the edge of being a terrorist group. And when the government went to disarm them, there was lots of shooting, lots of bullets, and lots of violence. But you can see, think about the difference between Martin Luther King and the Black Panthers. Martin Luther King, civil disobedience. These guys, the guy's got shotgun shells on his jacket. Maybe the last voice that had a say in the civil rights movement were assassins. On April 3rd, 1968, great song from U2, Martin Luther King was shot by a drifter, James Earl Ray, kind of a nobody. just a racist, never really accomplished much in his life. But you can see that's Martin Luther King had just been shot. He had given a speech that night, and it basically said, "I've been to the mountaintop." It sounded eerily to the people who were there, as if he was saying goodbye. And he was shot that evening, and that saddened many, many people. And it was a little while later that Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of the assassinated John F. Kennedy, running for president, probably would have been elected president in 1968, was assassinated in the back of a hotel. Famous image of the basically like the waiter, busboy, who had come to John or Robert's aid after he'd been shot. This is him on the floor. He was shot by, again, kind of a crazy drifter named Sirhan Sirhan. But here's the thing. We've lost these leaders, and it shook the movement. It doesn't grow the same way. And so your leaders are your most important. And here are two of the most important leaders in the civil rights movement, definitely the most important leader, Martin Luther King. And the civil rights movement kind of fizzles. And the 70s are not really a time for gains for civil rights, not like it had been in the 50s and 60s. And of course, it's not until many years later, 2008, when you could perhaps say that the civil rights movement finally ends, when America elects a black president. So that is all for 14.1. A lot of details, a lot of information, a lot of opportunities for enrichment. I hope you take advantage.